Now I'd like to welcome to the show Alex Trembath, Deputy Director at the Breakthrough Institute and a featured speaker at the recent Abundance 2025 conference here in Washington, D.C. Alex was also our guest for episode 15, all the way back in April 2023. So welcome back to Free the Economy, Alex.
Hey, Richard, thanks so much for having me back.
A lot of people attended that big conference, Abundance 2025 here in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago, and you were a speaker there. And, we briefly mentioned this in the news segment a couple episodes back in episode 140. And I read a very brief snippet from the remarks you gave there. But let's do a couple things. First, in order to give sort of new listeners an introduction, just sort of very big picture, what does abundance mean when we talk about it? Talk about society, public policy, law, all that stuff. What's the elevator pitch for abundance? And then we can get into talking about what actually happened at the conference.
Absolutely. So, yeah, abundance is a kind of social intellectual movement that has emerged over really the last 4 or 5 years. I really think of the COVID pandemic as sort of year zero for the abundance movement, even though like abundance ideas around sort of housing and energy and state capacity pre-existed the pandemic. But abundance as a sort of centralizing concept really kicks off with an essay that Derek Thompson writes in 2021 and the writing of Matt Iglesias and his Slow Boring podcast and Ezra Klein at the New York Times and Jerusalem Dempsey at the Atlantic and a bunch of advocacy and activist organizations like the Breakthrough Institute and the Institute for Progress and the Welcoming Neighbors Network and the YIMBY movement that all sort of cohere around this idea of abundance over the last few years. And the central sort of high level idea is that sort of policy needs to make it easier to sort of build and deploy more of the sort of material and economic opportunity that sort of American citizens need to experience improving quality of life and cost of living. Things like housing, things like energy, things like basic commodities, things like sort of public services and public goods, all of which we do have in a kind of historic abundance in the world and in America today. We've never been richer. We've never had sort of more material abundance. At the same time, it has become harder to afford a house on a middle class income. Energy prices are rising. Americans experience their government as ineffective as opposed to responsive. And so the abundance movement is a kind of broad approach to addressing those problems that Americans have with sort of access to basic goods and services and public services.
All right, excellent. So the recent conference brought together a lot of people from different backgrounds and kind of different ideological angles, and you sort of talked about this in your remarks at the conference. Um, there's a fair amount of heterogeneity, right, among people about the at different points of the political spectrum and who are focused on different angles of public policy, but nevertheless find it a certain, to use a fancy word, consilience, around the idea of making things more abundant and policies to allow broadly abundance to flourish. Um, what was that experience like being sort of one of those, co-presenters, organizers there? And where, I guess I would say, how much distance do you think we've covered since the earliest times when people started using using that word just a few years ago?
Yeah, so I, as you know, having been to some events that I've organized in the past, I've been helping to organize conferences for over a decade now, mostly for my think tank, the Breakthrough Institute. We would organize a West Coast conference and an East Coast conference. And over the last couple years, I've been privileged to help spearhead this new effort to co-host a co-hosted, co-branded abundance conference with a bunch of the other groups that I mentioned earlier, including Niskanen and the Foundation for American Innovation, Institute for Progress, Welcoming Neighbors Network, Federation of American Scientists. We had 15 co-hosts in total and 9 or 10 sponsors. So there's like a bunch, really, like dozens or more of new sort of abundance affiliated or abundance identified organizations that are all, as we're talking about, sort of rallying under this common banner. And as you're getting at in your question, Richard, it covers a broad range of sort of interests, subject matter, expertise, and even sort of political ideology, which is one of the more sort of salient things for me as an event organizer. Actually, like I'm actually very used to at this point organizing Breakthrough Institute events where everyone who comes there, even if they have strong differences of opinion with each other and with me, understand that this is like a breakthrough eco-modernist environmental thing where they'll hear about nuclear, they'll hear about industrial agriculture, they'll hear about decoupling versus degrowth, they'll hear about all of the things that someone who self-selects into a Breakthrough Institute event would expect to encounter. With abundance, it's just such a big tent, with so many different issues at play and so many different sort of levels of expertise. So at the same time as you have sort of DC-based wonky think tankers trying to sort of reform the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or the Food and Drug Administration, you have like local housing activists from the Bay Area or from Wyoming who are flying across the country because abundance is their community and it is their movement. And at the same time as you have that, we had I think over 30 elected officials like state and local legislators, mayors, comptrollers, councilmen and women who are trying to sort of deliver abundant solutions through their policymaking. And then, of course, we had, journalists and philanthropists and investors and scientists, and it was just a pretty wide range of sort of professionals and expertises and interests. And so that was what was sort of most salient to me as somebody who's been kind of organizing and going to events for a long time, just the breadth and the variety of participants in the abundance movement that have sort of found their home in this idea so far.
And we have seen this, bubble up for people like you especially, but me as well, who are sort of in this sort of like wonky think tank, policy analysis world. There's been a lot to chew on and read over the past few years. But for people who aren't kind of deep into that and doing it all day, every day, I feel like there's been a handful of places where this is sort of, like I said, bubbled up to the sort of normie awareness. One of those is the book Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson that, you mentioned both of those guys, and they've been talking about this all for a while. And I've heard both of them talk about these topics at Breakthrough Institute events before the book was published. But for a popular book by two popular authors that, and it seems like they have done every podcast, maybe except for this one, doing interviews about it. That is sort of a kind of a signal point, right? Where people who didn't pay attention to this before maybe started paying attention to it. So, do you consider that like an inflection point, like a big deal that the book coming out?
It's a total inflection point, and I'll say that the abundance movement and the sort of abundance coalition, I think considers itself sort of bigger than the book, and in many ways, certainly predates the book. So the book comes out this spring of 2025. We launched this event last fall, before the book had come out. But like I said earlier, despite the fact that a bunch of us in the Abundance Coalition think of ourselves as having been doing abundance for years or decades. The Breakthrough Institute, where I work, was founded almost 20 years ago to create a new environmental politics of abundance. We used that terminology and to sort of create a new kind of environmentalism that builds for the 21st century. Likewise, Niskanen has been around for a long time. Federation of American Scientists has been around for 80 years. These ideas about state capacity and sort of energy innovation and scientific progress and the progress movement, they all predate the book. The YIMBY movement in particular is this extremely well built out and kind of populated movement, long before the abundance movement, abundance as a centralizing idea, or the abundance book exist. That said, it is a really important kind of uh, articulation of the idea and of the ideas of the movement, and its sort of significance to sort of the broader culture, that the rest of us in the movement didn't or couldn't, I would argue, accomplish on our own. Like it is one thing to be a bunch of eco-modernists pushing for more nuclear energy and industrial agriculture, or a bunch of housing activists and sort of local housing groups pushing for upzoning and sort of deregulation of housing markets. It's another thing for some of the most well-known public intellectuals in America to make the affirmative case for these ideas to a sort of mass public audience. And so like it wasn't that's not to say it was like just kind of branding sort of operation by Klein and Thompson. They really, their writing really did kind of rally a bunch of us to this idea, and in particular, I think rallied a bunch of like elected officials to these ideas. So all of that's a long way of saying that these ideas sort of predated the book and the movement and the pandemic and everything we've been talking about, and I think the book and the sort of broader writing of a few of these really important public intellectuals did change the game for the abundance movement.
Yeah, and as long as we're citing our history, I need to shout out to our Free the Economy's very first episode, our very first guest ever, Alex Tapp, uh, of these Two for Progress, who was guest number one for episode titled "Deregulating Abundance" back in 2022. Um, that is a fun history to see these ideas grow and the people who are involved with them become more prominent, have influence on public policy and like real tangible effects for human beings, which of course is what abundance is about, is making life better for people, giving them more options, a higher standard of living for not a more expensive price. So let's go back and look at some of like the biggest sort of categories here, and see what sort of effects we're seeing. So housing is probably maybe the most often talked about, in terms of abundance, like you talked about the yes in my backyard, the YIMBY movement, people who are opposed to the NIMBYs, the no in my backyard movement, people who don't want any new thing to be built anywhere, including housing. Uh, we had uh, we had Max Dubler from California, who's a YIMBY king. We love him from back all the way in episode 18. And the YIMBY folks in California have had a big win. State passed Senate Bill 79, which allows more dense housing close to transit corridors. Um, California, one of those places where the sort of progressive version of abundance is popular in lots of places, but in some of the most famous, big blue cities, San Francisco and LA, up until very recently, they have not had a great record of implementing actual abundance policies, and they have very high housing prices. So, where do you think housing as part of abundance is right now? Are we seeing big changes? Again, we had this just recently, this SB 79 in California change. We've got potentially options with the wildfires in LA, and there's a lot of people who are kind of discontented about how fast the build back is going, and then people maybe we're going to see a pivot point there about people wanting more abundant, relevant, zoning rules and things. Where are we at?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the point you made in there, Richard, about the kind of like blue and progressive locales that were sort of falling short of putative abundance goals, right? And I honestly think that's a big part of why abundance and the YIMBY housing movement in particular have really taken off over the last 5, 10 years or so, which is that, a bunch of folks are progressives. They are Democrats. They live in sort of coastal urban enclaves that have progressive social values and sort of prioritize egalitarianism and sort of care for lower income, marginalized, disadvantaged communities. And they looked around and they realized like how can we call ourselves progressive when we live in like the most expensive enclaves ever created by human beings, and the nature of those enclaves is protected by government policies overseen by like overwhelmingly or entirely blue, progressive, capital D, Democratic politicians. And so the housing movement sort of launches in the Bay Area, not on accident, right? Because it was a bunch of sort of self-identified progressives living in like the progressive mecca of the San Francisco Bay Area, and both themselves not realizing that they're not able to afford the houses and the housing that they wanted. But looking around and realizing that that was true for everybody, and in particular for lower income folks. I think that is why the housing movement really sort of takes root in blue places like Boston, like San Francisco, like Washington, D.C. Of course, now it has spread to, the rest of the country and to less dense, less urban, less sort of crowded places. At our conference, we had, folks from Idaho and Wyoming talking about how, sort of their style of housing abundance is a little different than it is in Berkeley or Washington, D.C. But that's sort of, I think, a big reason why it starts. And it's a big reason why I think figures like Matt Iglesias, who was writing about this at the time, and Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson have been writing about it so prominently. It was because these are, basically sort of progressive public intellectuals and activists who got sick of the nature of modern 21st century progressivism, which, we can talk more about this, was less a driver of sort of economic abundance and economic opportunity, and more a sort of protectorate for particular political interests, for sort of incumbents, and for honestly sort of politicians and elected officials themselves. And so the housing movement sort of emerges to address that acute problem, sort of regulations and sort of NIMBY elected officials who are making it difficult to build that housing that people say they need. But it then sort of evolves into a broader project to improve sort of local government and government policy at large, and that's why we have all these conversations about sort of state capacity and effective governance within the abundance conversation now.
Well, yeah, so we have a great example like this, which is about um, concerns mostly concentrated in urban areas, and this is something that people deal with every day. Everyone lives someplace, uh, whether it's a house, their apartment, or a house or apartment they hope to have access to in the future. Uh, but let's look at possibly the other, maybe co-biggest subtopic here under abundance besides housing, which is energy. Most people do not live at a nuclear or natural gas power plant, so it's not the sort of thing that people have that direct everyday access to and personal one-on-one experience with. But we all use energy, so it is something that is directly relevant to our the abundance and affordability of energy is something that is a little further separated, but it's nevertheless has a big impact on our day-to-day lives. So this is definitely something where I feel like this is where really breakthroughs, bread and butter here, which is environmental policy and energy production. Um, I feel like we have also had in the past, I was going to say a few years, maybe 2 years, maybe 6 to 9 months, a big change in policy at the federal level. Uh, so we had many years of uh, climate-focused energy policy, and including net zero targets and policy that was intended to be harmonized with the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement and the international uh, sort of negotiating framework of the United Nations. But with the return of Donald Trump to the White House, we have a very different moment. So this is something, like you said, the housing abundance debate got started by a lot of people and fueled by a lot of people in more sort of progressive left Democrat blue cities. The energy abundance, at least one version of it, is more likely, I feel like, going to be people from like your friends from Wyoming and Texas and Louisiana, possibly. More likely to be Republican members of Congress, more likely to be conservatives who are like, yes, drill, baby, drill. We need more emergent, America First energy policy. Um, how does that fit into the more kind of progressive state capacity version of abundance, where the sort of the Chris Wright, Doug Burgum, Donald Trump pro domestic energy faction, how do those guys talk to each other?
It's a really well formulated question, Richard, because there are similar dynamics at play between housing and energy and a bunch of the subjects within abundance. With housing, you have local rules about building height and about density and about proximity to transit or green spaces or sort of brownfield development. A whole bunch of rules and regulations that make it difficult or illegal to build new housing. And the YIMBY movement was designed to address that. Similar stuff happens in energy. You have a bunch of federal and state and local rules and regulations that make it difficult or impossible to build energy infrastructure, whether that's drilling or pipelines or transmission lines or mines or power plants, what have you. And these are things like the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act and sections of the Clean Water Act and the National Historic Preservation Act at the federal level. I'm talking to you from California, where we have our own sort of statewide regulations like the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA. And then you also have sort of more pecuniary rules like the state of California's ban on building new nuclear power plants. So even if you solved a bunch of the other federal and state level regulatory obstacles to energy infrastructure investment, it's literally illegal to build a new nuclear plant in California. So you have to fix that law too. So it is a similar dynamic. You've got these sort of rules and regulations in place, blocking and obstructing infrastructure investment and deployment. And the abundance movement, particularly the sort of energy and infrastructure wing of the abundance movement, kind of populated by Breakthrough and Institute for Progress and Niskanen and American Conservation Coalition and Employ America and some other folks are sort of working as feverishly as we can for permitting reform at the federal and state level and to kind of build up sort of an abundance movement for energy and for energy infrastructure, sort of synonymous to the movement that we see in housing. To the point you're making, Richard, I do think it will look different because no one lives in a nuclear power plant and no one
Mhm.
lives in a wind turbine. And so people sort of showing up to their local planning commissions are just not going to advocate for new energy infrastructure in the way that they advocate for literally the houses that they want to personally live in. But there are sort of similar policy dynamics at play. And then, on your last point about sort of energy abundance within the second Trump administration, I count myself among those who was, more than cautiously optimistic, honestly, after President Trump was reelected last November, after he selected, Chris Wright, sort of longtime energy executive, and former Governor Burgum as two of his cabinet secretaries who would oversee, sort of federal energy policy, because these were, sort of all of the above kind of like energy abundance, that what they called energy dominance guys. And you've seen a more kind of mixed record, I would argue, in the 9 or 10 months since the Trump administration took over earlier this year. In which there's been, a bunch of sort of promising work on nuclear regulation and sort of federal support for next generation nuclear technologies, which is a big interest of ours. At the same time, you do have both the Departments of Energy and Interior sort of lashing out, for lack of a better word, against renewable energy and sort of arbitrarily sort of canceling projects, transmission lines, wind farms, sort of solar and battery manufacturing projects that were celebrated by the Biden administration as what at times appears to be a kind of act of political revenge as opposed to an investment in American industrial capacity or energy dominance. So
Right.
all of that is to say that energy abundance is an imperative, that there is some bipartisan agreement about that. Like Republicans are the ones who have been arguing to reform these regulatory obstacles for decades. But, with Republicans in power right now, the record is a little mixed so far, to say the least.
Well, yeah, I think with some of those renewable projects, at least from my perspective, that there's an argument against not continuing them if a reasoned analysis finds that they are a sort of money pit of endless subsidies. But there is certainly uh, the impression that you allude to that some people in the administration just think that they're woke, right? That they're just
Right.
somehow politically incorrect for vague ideological reasons, not for any sort of like practical infrastructure reasons. And so that's the ideologically correct perspective to take if you're in the administration, is just be anti renewable in any context. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Um, like I said, I think that housing and energy are the two really big buckets when it comes to people talking about abundance policy in general. But the dynamics here apply to all sorts of stuff, practically everything, including big picture quality of life issues, um, where we have high cost and constrained supply. And ideally, we could change our laws and policies and get more supply and at lower cost, including things like education and healthcare, right? Areas where there is a huge amount of government intervention, regulation, and restriction, and where we've seen uh, increasing costs and decreasing effectiveness. Even in some cases, I would say outright declines in overall quality, but certainly at the very least, declining marginal increases per unit of extra, million, $1 billion. So I know you are not a full-time education or healthcare policy analyst, but you are a deep in the vital blood flow of abundance discourse in general. Um, what have you what have you heard? What are you encouraged by, or what are you excited about in applying abundance ideas to things like education, or sort of adjacent to that, sort of childcare, also part of this world, and healthcare in general, healthcare reform.
The first and sort of highest level thing that I would say that I'm encouraged about within the Abundance Coalition is a abundance of really strategic analytical thinking about that question. Because it is one thing to say we need housing abundance, we need energy abundance, we need healthcare abundance, we need childcare abundance, and on and on and on. It is another thing to offer like tractable policy solutions to those different problems because they are different problems, and it's much easier said than done to achieve abundance of any of those things, or to kind of port lessons from one area over to another. Like we were just talking about the similarities and differences between housing and energy. The similarities between energy and childcare are obviously much faster. So, like you said, I'm not an expert on all of those things, but again, was privileged to help put together this whole conference. And on healthcare, for instance, honestly learned a lot in sort of some pre-meeting and pre-conversations about the session that my colleagues at R Street and the Institute for Progress and the Niskanen Center put together on healthcare abundance. And some solutions within there are going to be things like, making it easier for nurse practitioners to provide like immediate health care that at the moment that is often required to be performed by an MD. There's obviously a whole other conversation about immigration abundance,
Mhm.
whether high skilled, low skilled, or all of the above, but that overlaps with the healthcare conversation as well, given the cap on MDs emigrating to this country and on their ability to practice medicine once they get here. That's a another conversation. And then there are a lot of important sort of policy problems imposed by the way that we test, regulate, and deploy new pharmaceutical solutions in this country. One of my views is that the abundance movement is really born of in the combination of the success and the failure during the COVID pandemic. You had the failure of our supply chains. You had material shortages. You had spikes in energy and housing prices. But then you also had this technological scientific miracle of the mRNA vaccines, which was just a proof of concept that like abundance can work if you actually design sort of policy and orient sort of technological scientific and industrial resources correctly, you actually can deliver hyperabundance of sort of miraculous new technologies, drugs, and things like that. And that's another sort of major focus of healthcare abundance that again, my colleagues at like Niscan and IFP could talk about more literally than I could. I do want to dwell on the sort of education and childcare example for a moment here because I think it's a particularly tricky one, actually. On the one hand, I think that sort of localities, which are mostly responsible for education policy, could aim towards delivery of more abundant educational opportunities, resources, things like charter schools, things like resources for homeschooling parents is a major focus of a bunch of abundance advocates who want to sort of increase optionality in the provision of education. And obviously things like charter and homeschool services are not uncontroversial in education
Right.
policy and those debates sort of port over into abundance. But the real tricky thing with sort of education and childcare, and I got at this just very briefly in the remarks that I gave on stage at the conference, is that these are fundamentally, at least at the moment, labor-intensive services
Right.
that we either haven't figured out how to get like robots and screens to do most or all of the educating of our children, or, and I think I would lean this way, we don't really want that. Like we actually want there to be some humanist, like literal human component to education. And because of sort of ball mall cost disease effects, these labor intensive sectors of the economy just sort of structurally become more expensive over time. So on the one hand, you can talk about like more abundant provision of educational or child care services. On the other hand, it's not obvious to me, and I would love to learn more about this, if how much that will sort of lower the costs of these things. Just a quick example, I have a toddler. He's in daycare 5 days a week, and it's like more expensive than sending him to UC Berkeley might be in 20 years, right? And then, grant it's only for a few years, and eventually we have the option of things like public school. But daycare is so expensive; it's thousands of dollars a month. But then when you actually look at what the daycare providers are taking home, it's not that much money, right?
Mhm.
They're not making $200,000-$300,000 a year, especially after you factor in the cost of owning a business, that their own sort of their own housing costs. So that is one of the challenges I think facing the abundance sort of movement and coalition at large is not just to figure out, okay, how, like, what are the bottlenecks? What are the policy, technological, infrastructural, sort of economic bottlenecks preventing a greater abundance of resources, services, opportunity? But like how solvable actually are those bottlenecks? Like you could actually Manhattanize San Francisco, right? Like in principle, you could raise the population of San Francisco by a factor of 5, 10, 20 if you wanted. There's no engineering or demographic reason why you couldn't do that. It's not obvious that you can actually lower the cost of daycare by very much in a sort of post-modern economy that is overwhelmingly populated by goods and services provisions.
Right. Some things respond more to scales of magnitude and economy than others. And this one comment on that. I think there's offensive plays and defensive plays, right? There's abundance policies that in lots of other areas we think could make a big difference if they were implemented. I think there's some policies here that would make a big positive difference if they're not implemented. I know in Washington D.C. there is a lot of talk about the city potentially requiring daycare workers to have a college degree. So you couldn't be a daycare worker unless you had a bachelor's degree in some relevant field like early childhood development. I think that would be a terrible idea. It would make it significantly more expensive, while not necessarily increasing the quality of childcare. So that sort of like hyper credentialization, which you see in lots of places in the economy. In terms of sort of like occupation licensing, is definitely a de-abundance, anti-abundance angle, which I think the abundance movement writ large, a lot of their probably the vast majority of their energy is going to be implementing new good ideas. They're going to be pro-abundance, but also at least some of it should be the energy should be spent defending against bad anti-abundance policies like that one that crop up in all sorts of places.
No, I think
So,
you and me and Alex Stapp, the guest on your first episode, were all at, Eco-Modernism 2022, I think it was, the conference that
mhm.
I helped organize a few years ago. And the theme there was deregulating abundance, sort of same as the title of your first episode with Alec, which is a recognition that, yeah, like we want to build more stuff. We want to invent new pharmaceuticals. We want to grow more food. But a huge amount of the abundance agenda is just going to be cutting red tape, right? It's just going to be eliminating anti-abundance rules that we place on certain sectors of the economy or certain provision of public goods, services, things like that. And occupational licensing requirements is a major one and a through line across sort of multiple fields, right? Like you have this insane occupational licensing requirement for daycare providers in Washington D.C., but you have similar stuff for barbers and hairdressers and even like lawyers and accountants, as I understand it. So sort of lobby for greater protections for their provision of services than is necessarily called for in a sort of rational, abundant society.
Right. Yeah, I think that it's a shout out to my friend and late mentor, Fred L. Smith Jr., who liked to say, uh, you don't have to teach the grass to grow. You just have to move the rocks off the lawn. And
Hmm.
that was his view of a lot of this kind of discourse. So before we wrap up, I want to take another one more chance and look at sort of like big picture, sort of like politics and society here. Uh, any of these abundance policies have a good chance of, the things we've talked about have a good chance of positively impacting the quality of life of people in America. Is their housing will be more affordable, energy will be more affordable, which means everything else is energy is the master resource, then it makes everything else possible. Maybe they get better access to healthcare and higher education and various stuff when good policies are implemented or bad ones are kept back. But what impact is all this going to have on our sort of society in general? So a lot of the debate up till now has said our our politics, our political spectrum, the way everything our society is organized. Uh, how do we go from the way things are now to these kind of better abundance policies? But I kind of want to ask, if we have better abundance policies, how will that change politics and society in general going forward? So this sort of analogy comes from environmental politics. So sometimes we talk about watermelon environmentalism, right? Where people are they're green on the outside, right? They say they're environmentalists, but really they have an allegiance to red, sort of communist socialist ideology on the inside. So that has been a right wing accusation that say, oh, the environmental movement, they're all just socialists and they want to make a more socialized society. But apropos of the abundance movement, there's another produce related analogy here, and that's avocado politics. So that's one in which there's an allegiance between green environmentalism on one side and brown, as in like brown shirt politics, which is authoritarianism or fascism on the other side. The idea that in a society of constrained resources where we're all constantly worried about there not being enough and opportunities being taken away and opportunities dwindling in the future, where we have degrowth, right? Where we have resource constraints all throughout society, people are more likely to turn to authoritarianism to deal with that. And so this is something Niels Gilman wrote about for BTI back in 2020. It was a fascinating essay. I encourage people to go back and look on it. The phrase avocado politics. Um, and the answer to that, right, is abundance, right? If we have a more abundant society where things are more affordable, where they're easier, where people feel like they have more opportunities, where their children have more opportunities in the future, they are less likely to turn to an authoritarian government to protect them, right? So that's my question. That's sort of, telegraphing my view on it. But do you think abundance is anti-fascist?
So I do. Certainly, I certainly agree with that sort of social political calculus that you just laid out so eloquently there, Richard. Um, Look, and I think most of us in sort of camp abundance believe that to some degree. I don't think we want to be Pollyannish or mechanistic about uh, the notion that abundance will deliver us into both a sort of more materially abundant future, but also like a kinder, gentler, more civil future. But I do think we believe there's a chance of that happening, and certainly something worth working towards on its own merits. I mean, I think if you look at the the sort of most rapid period of sort of technological and economic expansion in American history, which I believe just literally is the 30 years following World War II, the sort of the 30 glorious years, and other sort of advanced economies outside the U.S. benefited as well. But in that period, you had sort of massive technological innovation and diffusion of new technologies, not just things like organochloride pesticides and nuclear reactors, but televisions and radios and personal vehicles and washing machines and the world was literally sort of changing and advancing before our parents and grandparents' eyes in that period, and it was both a period of relative political comedy, arguably to some degree because Americans were united against the Red Menace in the USSR, but also I believe because when a rising tide is lifting all boats, it is easier to be sort of open to new neighbors, new ideas, and to new experiences. And we haven't had a period like that since then, And again, these are all pre-abundance ideas. You have concerns about the terminal boredom at the end of history, the great technological stagnation. These ideas are and sort of warnings are come from 30, 40 years ago. And we have been living in the end of history and the great stagnation for decades at this point. And I do think that the abundance movement wants and believes that housing, energy, material, economic abundance can help end the great stagnation, can help navigate, whatever phase of the end of history we think we're living through. And one of the reasons that I'm heartened by it, and one of the things that I'm still getting used to, is because there is getting used to in the abundance movement in particular, is because there are a couple things that I think abundance is doing really well so far, and that I would encourage everyone in Camp Abundance to sustain in the coming years. One is that it's a multi-partisan movement. Obviously we talked about how the housing movement really gets started in blue cities and blue states, but has really kind of scaled nationally and has taken root in rural areas and red states, in places run by Republicans and not just progressive Democrats. The abundance movement, sort of counts among its members both, sort of progressive organizations, like the Center for Public Enterprise and Employ America, but also conservative ones like the Foundation for American Innovation and sort of more libertarian free market organizations like the R Street Institute. And I think that is of a piece with abundance as a social intellectual movement. It is inherently pluralistic, and it hopefully models the kind of politics that I would prefer to see at scale. Like whatever one thinks of Biden or Harris or Trump or JD Vance, I think we can all agree that politics is angry and toxic right now, and it would be better if it were less that. Like in the abstract, sort of specific problems aside, and then the other piece of abundance that I find very encouraging is that it is a reformist movement for government. Again, like whether you're even if you're sort of a tax and spend big government Democrat, and I am friends with a lot of such people. I think we can all agree that government at all levels is sort of failing to deliver on the sort of services and leadership that Americans expect from the most well capitalized government in the history of the species, right? And so while abundance is both sort of pluralistic and materialist, like trying to address real material problems in the real economy. It is also takes a reformist approach to institutions and to governance in particular, and that approach is not one that says put the technocrats in charge and they will solve all of the people's problems for them. It is an approach that is reformist and that is trying to sort of strengthen the trustworthiness of our public institutions. And so, for all of those reasons, I am encouraged by both the kind of material effects that you're talking about and the potential of abundance politics to lift all boat, create a tide that lifts all boats. But also, I think the coalition is sort of modeling what good civic discourse and good institutional reform should look like. So we'll see where it goes.
All right. I think that was an excellent summary, and an inspiring one. So, Alex, thank you so much for being with us here. Before we go, please tell everyone where they can find your and Breakthrough's excellent work online.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, so we're at thebreakthrough.org. We also have a Substack called The Eco-Modernist, where I write regularly, and so do many of my colleagues at the Breakthrough Institute. And you can find me first initial last name at A Trembath on Twitter. I'm still on Twitter.
All right. We're still calling it Twitter, everyone. Remember.
I'm
Uh,
still calling it Twitter.
all right, Alex, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me again, Richard.